Hi, thank you all for joining us. I'm Ken Wallach, I'm president of NDI, and my job here is to welcome everybody and give a few very brief remarks about the program and the subject. I'll make them very brief. I'm not a techie, so I'm not going to pretend I know a lot about these issues, although our institution, NDI, cares deeply about these issues. We're engaged a great deal in all of our programs utilizing ICT. But I thought I'd just give a few reflections about recent experiences in Ukraine, where I returned a few weeks ago following the elections. We have been working since last year with many of the people who were engaged in the Euromaidan movement, and groups now, including new political parties, new civic organizations that emerged from the Euromaidan movement. And it has a direct relationship to the subject that our panelists will be talking about today, because the Maidan, like so many of the other square movements, utilized a great deal of technology in the way they organized and communicated with each other. Now, the demonstrations that began last November fundamentally altered the political dynamics in the country. They highlighted Ukrainians' demands for change, including more transparent, accountable, and uncorrupted political practices, as well as respect for basic civic and political rights. They led to the collapse of the government, its replacement by a more reform-oriented, EU-focused interim government, and the scheduling of a snap presidential election. But less visibly, they introduced accountability to citizens as a requirement of governance for perhaps the first time in Ukrainian history. But like so many movements on the square, Euromaidan was inchoate. It did not have strong leadership. It did not have organization. And if the demands of the Euromaidan movement is going to be realized in the coming weeks and months, it's going to require new political institutions that recognize that popular political participation has to be at the heart of a new governance structure in the country. And how to sustain the energy and the impact of Euromaidan in a way that won't require future Maidans to change fundamental public policy issues. It requires, as I mentioned, leadership, organization, capacity building, along with technology, and political institutions that will listen to citizens. And so the big challenge is how to move from the square to sustainable political participation. And this, in a sense, is what led NDI in general and led Kobo, in particular Kobo Price, to look at some past NDI programs that utilize technology, some successful and others less so, to determine what lessons that we could learn about the use of technology in programs that are to encourage, promote, and sustain genuine political participation around the world. All of the studies led to the need for interconnectedness between ICT, capacity building, organization, and political will on the part of the institutions with which citizens are supposed to engage. This began as an in-house document and an in-house study, but we thought, as a result of the work that was done, that it might have utility for a broader community among evaluators, donors, and other practitioners in this field. We are grateful for the support we've received from the National Endowment for Democracy to carry on this study. I want to thank Kobo Price and other staff members, particularly Jared Ford, for the work that was put into this study. And also want to thank the panelists, some of whom may have very divergent views on some of these issues. Ian and I were just talking about some of these issues. So I wanted to thank Robin Carnahan, a member of NDI's Board of Directors. They'll all get proper introductions in a few minutes. Josh Kaufman from AID, Ian Schuler, and Noel Dickover. So I want to thank all of them for taking the time. This is all about a learning process for us and hopefully others. We're fortunate to have people who have thought a lot about these matters. And hopefully we can put some of these lessons into practice as we try to meld technology with fundamental organization and organizational to have real impact in places where citizen engagement will be critical for the promotion and the sustainability of democracy. So I want to thank you all, and I guess I'm going to turn this over to Paul.
Thank you, Ken, and thank you everybody for coming. We appreciate you taking time late on your Thursday afternoon. I just wanted to speak very briefly about some of the purposes behind the study. My colleague Jared will talk a little bit about the methodology, and we'll hit on a conclusion or two, but really the purpose of today is to explore some of the ideas that we present, and as Ken said, whether or not they're matching with other institutes and individual experiences, particularly those experts that we've lined up to do that. For those of you who have worked with or engaged with NDI for some time, you know that our work is really informed by the knowledge that citizen participation is a powerful force for democratic and socioeconomic change. It's sort of the heart of what we do. And over the years, we've examined our program, and we think we have a really good understanding of the necessary elements for citizen participation, to contribute to democratization in different contexts. What are the elements in different contexts that we should be looking at? And so we think we can really identify what those are in the different countries in which we work, with the different donors, and with the different actors. We're less certain in this environment exactly what technology has to do with that. We all know it's improved technology. We've kind of talked about it. There's an exuberance for technology and enthusiasm for technology, certainly within Washington, certainly within the donor community and elsewhere. There's a little less evidence, we think, on exactly what the outcomes of applying technology to citizen participation programs is. So that's the impetus for this study. If we think we know what works with citizen participation, let's go out and look at some places where we said we were going to apply technology to those contexts and have it enhance or deepen the citizen participation processes that were important for those contexts. The research really was driven by, I think, the reasons we all do a lot of research. We felt as an institute we needed better insights into the relationship between technologies, the citizen participation programs around which they were constructed, or at least in which they were built into, and the broader political outcomes that they sought to achieve. So I'm going to ask Jared maybe talk a little bit about the methodology.
And before I jump to the methodology, I want to apologize for scheduling a citizen participation event at the same time as the first World Cup match. We broke a cardinal rule, knowing your audience. And if anyone who's following the game, there's a goal, feel free to stand up, put your hands in the air quietly. We'll all appreciate that. For the technology team, our mandate and our challenge has been to mainstream technology strategy, smart technology strategy, through all of NDI's democratization programs. So for us, this was a great opportunity to collaborate with the citizen participation team and to use one of their trusted analytical frameworks to take a look at the impact of technology on democratization. This study and the research methodology can be best described as a qualitative mixed methods approach. We started off with a desktop review looking over 60 programs with participation outcomes and technology as a critical component. That moved into several roundtables with many of the folks in the room, democracy and technology experts, and then some field research which incorporated most significant change evaluations, as well as some key informant interviews. All of that boiled down into an analysis of 5 case studies, 4 vignettes, all of which you can find in your study. and we used the citizen participation team's theory of change, incorporating voice, space, and accountability to analyze the outcomes. I think this conversation is coming at a very relevant time. This is a conversation that's been ongoing for several years. Coincidentally, the aid and donor community is just jumpstarting an initiative focused on principles around digital development. And after meeting with that community and wanting to push that forward, we see a lot of the findings in this study reinforcing and mirroring that initiative as well.
So just a couple quick comments on the study itself, and we'll dive into the meat of the program. For those who haven't seen a copy of it, we do have them available outside. It's also available in digital format, NDI.org and EPUB and PDF. What we found sort of macro level, that technology clearly, somewhat intuitive, is being used to increase political space in a variety of different contexts where it didn't exist. There's also an increase in the quantity of voices and opportunities for the voices to express themselves. What we found to be less universal was that those voices were getting political traction and those spaces were meaningful opportunities for civil society and citizens to engage. And we think those two are very important for democratic development. We saw some other, I guess I'd say, assumptions that were more, I think, challenged by our research. Those being that marginalized populations who have access to technology will suddenly become more politically active or develop more political clout simply because of the technology. In particular, we noticed the aspirations, I think, that a lot of us have, and we sometimes feel maybe the donor community has a little greater strength. Aspirations for technology's democratizing influence are probably a bit high. We haven't seen the outcomes that a lot of us would have hoped for, and some of that too is tied back to the lack of a real plausible connectivity between the application of technology democratization programs and the democratic outcomes that we seek. There's somehow kind of a missing link of political development, and we saw that in many ways as being tied to the lack of available resources from the donor community to do the non-technological aspects of political development programs where technology was central to the theme of that particular intervention. I won't get into other ones. I think we have 13 or so findings in this. They're probably worth a peruse through. But with that, I want to hand it off to Nathaniel Heller, who's graciously agreed to be our moderator today. Nathaniel is the Executive Director of Global Integrity. Many of you may know him with his role there, or Open Gov Hub. He's going to lead us forward. Thank you.
Hi everybody. So my main job is to catch up with the 25 minutes that we're behind, I think, and to somehow not completely do these four panelists wrong. So a huge thanks to Jared and Koval for having me here. I'll try and talk very little, especially because we're behind, and let these four smart folks do most of the talking. So I was instructed to bring them up with just name and title. Then what we will do is to give you a bit more about where they're coming from if you don't know that already, ask for some initial reflections on the study, because I've all read it and have memorized it in depth. I'll ask a few more questions. We'll try and have as much of a discussion as we can. So both for the panelists and for the audience, please no speeches and sort of ramblings. I mean, we're tight on time. Let's try and make this conversational and responsive. And then we'll, if we can, save some time at the end, do some Q&A again. Less speeches and reflections, more questions and interactivity if we can get there. So I will try and be really mean if people violate those rules. So with that rambling introduction, let me first invite Robin Carnahan up to the 1-foot podium. Robin, as I'm sure many of you know, deeply involved with NDI for many, many years, and the former Secretary of State of Missouri. Josh Kaufman from USAID's hot, hip, new development lab. That's the official tagline, right? Ian Schuler from also hot and hip development city, one of the cities and countries and world's leading technology, data viz, mapping geo firms that does a lot of work around these issues. And Noel Dickover now at U.S. Institute for Peace, and most importantly, Master Pumpkin Carver, which is serious. Okay. Yeah, good. Excellent. Oh, okay. So we have two mics, so we'll have to do a bit of sharing, and I've been reminded to encourage folks, both up here and in the audience, to speak into the mics. So I'll start with Robin and start with a nicer version of the amazing biography, and then Robin, ask you for some initial reactions to the study. But as I mentioned, Robin Carnahan, who is the renowned former Secretary of State of Missouri, goes back many decades, I think, in this community of practice, and has worked deeply both with NDI and many other shops around the democratization and sort of governance reform efforts at Export-Import Bank previously. So Robin, when you were reading through this drawing on your very, very deep and rich history, what jumped out at you? Was this complete common sense in terms of the findings? Was it something in between? What was new and exciting that you saw?
There was a lot of common sense to it, I will say. And I wanted to start with a little story. Because civic participation is sort of a fancy word for, how do you make a change in your community? And I grew up in a family where that wasn't an unusual thing, to think that you could actually affect change in your community. And the reason we did that was because we could see that there were actually results that could come from participating. So one of the key things is always connecting that idea or passion to actual results, because nobody's going to waste their time if there's not a process or a system in place to actualize on what your aspirations are. So my story is, the first civic participation that I remember, I was probably 11 years old. And it was the summertime, and I was out at our local swimming pool. And it was a horrible pool, a public pool in this little town that I grew up in, and the paint was chipping and it was cracked, and but it was a swimming pool and it was summer and I was a kid, and so I was pretty happy. And I didn't know that I shouldn't be happy until we went to a neighbor town's swimming pool. And it was a much smaller town. It was like a third of the size of this little bitty town I grew up in. It had 13,000 people. This place had like 3,000 people. And it had a great swimming pool. And I remember that night going home and saying to my parents, how is it that this little town of St. James has this beautiful swimming pool, and they're so small we don't even play them in sports, and yet they have a beautiful swimming pool? Well, Mom and Dad told the story that, in St. James, that there was this wealthy family that started a foundation, and the foundation gave money to parks, and the swimming pool's in the park, and so that's how they got their great swimming pool. So I said immediately, being a smart kid who can connect the dots, do we have any rich people in Rara who are about to die and who want to give money for a swimming pool? And they laughed and said, well, probably not, but there are other ways that if people in the community want to get together to have a better swimming pool, that you can do this. And so at a young age, I understood what a bond issue was, right? And so the next year rolls around, and sure enough, we're going to have a vote. So fast forward, my parents and others got involved in thinking about this, but then it was time for the kids to get involved to recruit their friends to go knock on doors to get people to vote for the swimming pool. Election comes and goes, lo and behold, it passes. All these kids are like, whoa, this is incredible. And a couple years later, we end up with a swimming pool. And so I tell you that story to say civic participation is about thinking there is a roadmap to get you to an end result that you want to have. Technology is not something that we needed at that time or had at that time, but there were tools that we used, and whether it was organizing, whether it was going door to door, whether it was getting our parents to do things, those were the tools that we used to get these things achieved. What we're seeing today is this transformation with the new tools. But the need for the idea, the system and the process to actualize on that and getting results so that people want to stay engaged, that part hadn't changed. So the exciting thing to me to see what NDI is doing here in this space and taking such a lead is to be able to use this new technology in ways that helps empower people. And whether it's by coming up with a parallel vote count, or whether it's by other ways to figure out if you're on a voter list, or whether it's helping political parties organize, those are the tools. I'm convinced that the people in all of these societies, they've got the passion. They don't always have the political space to get the things done, and that's where these tools come into play. But for all of us, the reminder is so strong that the technology piece is the means, it's not the end. And it's just something that we can't ever forget. And so bravo for having a conversation about this, and to remind people that we've got to continue to push on these things and use not just those tools, but the political acumen to know how to change those levers of power. And I hope we can get into that a little bit further.
Thanks, Robin. Next, let me turn to Josh Kaufman, who's, and I'll get this wrong, I'm sure, currently heading the Monitoring and Impact Assessment Office of the New Development Lab at USAID, which is great, but you have a long and deep... Yeah, it's on here, I just don't read. But has a long and really rich history with the agency, working on democratization, with governance, helped to lead a lot of the innovation work over the past few years. So, coming from the donor perspective, Josh, do you have a similar reaction to Robin? It's a tool towards an end, or sort of a slightly different take?
Yeah, I mean, I think, actually I do have a similar reaction, and I do want to emphasize that I'm not a technologist, I just play one in the office, but I really am sort of a democracy, human rights, and governance person, and when I read this report, it was really from that perspective. I thought I thank NDI actually for publishing this report, because it's such a new field. It's calling out for more testing, more evidence, and more dialogues like this. I can't really quibble with any of the 13, which seemed like an unlucky number, so I have 14 in a second, 13 conclusions, but really what I pulled from it is when you're looking at programs that are using technology to support civic participation, when you're looking for the killer app, it's not the technology, it's still the citizen, it's still the person. And now that I'm looking across multiple sectors, and not just democracy, there's still, and maybe there always will be for reasons we get into, a pretty significant gap, right? So if you're looking at health, or to a lesser extent, agriculture, energy, the technology solution is getting closer and closer to the actual solution. And we're still a ways away from that, and probably always will be. But nonetheless, we know, and this report demonstrates some great examples, that access to social media, particularly through mobile devices, access to the internet, dramatically lowers the cost of entry when it comes to citizen participation and collective action, and also provides real opportunities to make governments more responsive and transparent. So the technology itself does play a key role. So let me get to the 14th conclusion, which we're finding in USAID already, which is it's easy to be overwhelmed by the speed of growth in terms of access to this technology, but if you look underneath, there are some real access issues. Right? And so one of the things that we're trying to do over the last year or so is, and we feel as a donor we're well placed to do that, is to work on some of these core issues. Let me just talk about what 3 of them are. One was absolutely highlighted in this report, which is the gender gap, the digital gender gap, which is, and sometimes culturally, is highly significant. So we've established, with some of the tech companies and banks and donors, an alliance called Mobile Women, which is designed to eliminate that gender gap. And we know in certain circumstances we could have some dramatic impact. The alliance was founded in 2011. Its first work was in Iraq, and at that point, only 20% of mobile subscribers in Iraq were women. So we worked with the largest mobile provider, and they developed a whole new product line that was geared specifically to women and had features that, for example, ways to block harassers and things like that. Within 2 years, there were 2 million additional women subscribers. And it wasn't just that the market was growing, the proportion of women subscribers doubled within those 2 years. Another key issue is affordability, right? And we know that particularly in terms of broadband and internet access through mobile devices, which in the poorest 45 countries in the world is growing much slower than the rest of the market. So just this fall, we established, along with 3 African governments, and Microsoft, Facebook, Google, an Alliance for Affordable Internet that was launched in Nigeria. And the goal of that alliance in the target countries is to get broadband access down to 5% of monthly income. Right now in Lagos, this seems really crazy, so don't quote me on this, but I think it's something like 1,000 times more expensive per month to get broadband access in real dollar terms than it is in Monaco. Right? But obviously people in Monaco are a little bit wealthier than people in Lagos. The third thing, and it actually touches on one of the Uganda examples, is we're seeing a real proliferation of these individual mobile applications that are designed to give citizen voice and provide opportunities for entering real-time data, right? So issues like human rights violations, corruption, electoral fraud. In some countries, we're starting to get pushback from our counterparts, either in civil society or government, that are saying, well, there's too many of these things, that every donor, every foundation is coming in and designing new ones, and we're spending all day entering stuff in. So we worked with the government in Uganda to try to create a single a single application, or a single framework across the country that would have the same interface. People could hang applications on it. And the USpeak application, I think, is built off of that. And there's ones that in the health ministry, the education ministry. And the nice thing, because it's open source, is there's now something called U-Report, which was created to give citizens voice and thing in matters of the day. And there's now, or at least as of the end of last year, it's probably much larger, 250,000 people that are generating 50,000 reports per week. So it's So anyway, those are sort of 3 examples where as donors we're trying to get across those, or solve some of those barriers.
Great, thanks, Josh. Ian, I think you've had a unique professional history amongst the finalists here, having started and worked heavily at places like NDI, State Department. Yes, I have headphones. Not in this building, I suppose. And then working at a commercial software company, sort of trying to build a business around some of these same values and agendas. I'm curious, again, your reactions from that perch.
Yeah, and in between trying to figure out how to fund and support organizations to do this sort of work as well. And so, I definitely, in looking at the report itself, it reflected a lot of, I worked on some of the programs that were case studies. I was familiar with a lot of the stories and the inclination, sort of the learnings behind them. As Jared mentioned, there are other people in other parts of the development field who have come to similar sets of conclusions. We've been doing this work for a long time as well. UNICEF has their set of principles. There's the 9 principles that USAID's adopted. There's the Green Tree principles. There are other sets of principles that are out there that look very similar to some of the conclusions of this report as well. So I think there is an awareness within the development community that that we need to get better, and that this is a more complex issue than just dropping in technology, shaking, and coming back and finding pluralistic democratic countries. So, but beyond that, I do want to kind of push back a little bit on the premise and on some of the aspects of the paper. It is a good paper. There's some great advice in there. If you have not read it, I would encourage you all to read it. But I do want to push back a bit. Before I push back, I will let everyone know that the score is currently 1-1, Brazil-Croatia, at the end of the first quarter of this first half. What I wanted to push back on was there's a bit of a disconnect between the overall setup of the paper, which is what is the role between technology and civil society development, and the evidence base of where the lessons were drawn from, which is pretty much exclusively from democracy development programs, from work that NDI has done, from other practitioners that you've spoken to. And I think we have to be honest in recognizing that a lot of the most innovative, a lot of the largest and most notable applications of technology to organizing have come outside of the efforts of development organizations and democracy promotion organizations. And I think that kind of begs the question on why is that the case? That everything from from Iran to the monks in Burma to Tahrir to Morsi Meter to Tunisia, a lot of these involve personalities who are not part of democracy assistance programs, and I think it begs the question of why is that the case, but also a reflection on what are the things that we as a field, as a community, are good at, and what are the things that we're not good at. And I think we are good at things. We're certainly good at things, and this document does a good job of showing some of the things we are good at. We're really good at working with institutions. We're really good at applying technology to methods and models that are already working to make them better and more efficient. We're not really good at inventing new models. We're not really good at ad hoc and opportunistic applications of technology and tools, and those sorts of things elude us. And I think that the paper makes an assumption in the way that it lays this out, that this is a awareness and education issue, and frankly the principles do as well. And I think that's part of the story, but I've participated in a lot of fail fairs over the years. For those of you who don't know it, it's basically people who do technology and development coming together and talking about all the ways that we've messed up, so that hopefully other people don't have to mess up in the same way to learn those lessons. And I keep going to these, and after 4 or 5, I was sort of discouraged. I mean, I want to go to these and believe that the reason that we're failing is because we're taking these big, bold risks at the edge of what's possible, and we're learning things from that. But we're not. We're making the same mistakes over and over again. We're not actually doing market research on things that in the private sector you would be expected to. And that's not because we don't know better. It's because the issues aren't knowledge issues, they're structural issues. And there are structural issues around the way that work is done and organizations come together that prevent us from being good at certain things. And that starts, obviously USAID has a role in this as well. I know that there are many areas of technology that people are thinking about, how do we change the structure? For instance, it's hard to do market research because you have to put in a proposal that has a 18-month plan, and you have to put in that plan what you're going to do, and the donor is holding you to that. And so if you do research in the beginning, and you're only going to find out the ways in which that plan isn't going to work, which doesn't seem like a good use of your resources when you have to do that plan anyway because you just signed your life away to do that. And I think that if we are going to get better at this, we need to change those structures, and it's going to take a real effort to do so. Monitoring evaluation, I think, is an incredibly important part of that. I think that there are two trends right now that are both well-intentioned but working in opposite directions. And one is the desire to collect better data, to have better data, to know up front what the data is that we're going to be collecting. That's all very well-intentioned so that we can better learn, but it's also making our programming less flexible and running against inclinations to want to be innovative, to want to be agile, to want to be edgy. And so maybe we need different sorts of programmatic interventions, different sorts of funding mechanisms. But I think that we're going to continue to be bad at innovation as a field until we change the way that we're structured, until we change the way that we work. So I'll leave it at that for now. We can get into more in the questions.
Yeah, that's great. Actually, it might be a reasonable segue to Noel Dickover, who is at USIP now, has done some amazing work, as I'm sure a number of you know, over the years, particularly the tech camps, and doing a lot of serious practitioner consulting work to sort of figure out some of this bridging between what Ian was saying, the sort of formalistic, and I don't mean that pejorative way, but the sort of formal, traditional actors, methods, and partners we tend to know how to do work well with, and sort of like kids off the street who might walk into a tech camp, literally, like you don't know who they are, but they might have a good idea. So, yeah, from that vantage point, again, a unique sort of perch. How do you process what you've been reading?
I completely agree with everything Ian just said on that, and Ian can elaborate it, but just a couple points on the report. I love that you have failures in there, and even some of them that you could easily spin to be successes, like how many 100,000 people commented on our thing, but it really didn't work. I love that. That I think is a really important contribution, and really sucking into the report to actually say, here's where we think we've done well, here's where we kind of didn't make it work, and here's our best guess as to why. And I think that in and of itself is a really important contribution to these type of reports, and we'd love to see lots more of them instead of, here's NDI touting their own horn. It's much more, I thought it was very reflective, and really wanted to emphasize that. Just a quick vignette, we did one of these tech camps in Kiev on global citizenship in like September 2012. Was really well attended, and the tech camp format is bringing local technologists together with local civil society and bringing a few internationals in. And Wayne Moses-Burke, I don't know how many know here, he was there doing advocacy. And the embassy had a little bit of extra money, and they said, there's these two eastern cities, you've probably never heard of them, Donetsk and Kharkiv, but it'd be great if we can get 2 or 3 of these folks out there and meet with civil society there. And we got IREX to set us up in some other Gates Foundation libraries. Great cities, by the way, really, really cool stuff. And in Kharkiv, we're in this very sort of old library, just packed with paper, and 20-some people are crammed in these weird computer, things. And we've got sort of 3 technologists doing their thing. And Wayne is talking about advocacy, and he has about 5 or 6 people with him who are either librarians or educators who are really trying to do interesting things with after-school programs to augment what they saw as a very stifled education process, and they had virtually no resources to do it, and so they're trying to figure out how. And so Wayne's like, well, there's these great things you can do with digital tools with advocacy, and it was almost a complete dead halt. Like, well, you're asking us to sort of talk to people to get more money. We're not allowed to do that. We can't publicly say anything against from where the government wanted us to go. We can't do that or we get fired. So Wayne says, well, you must have supporters and advocates for you that you can, get them to advocate on your behalf, and they're like, yeah, but we really can't ask them to do that either. And they were almost really hesitant to even understand this whole advocacy thing and why you would do it in the first place. And if you don't get advocacy, applying mobile to it isn't going to get you anywhere. And that's, in essence, what I saw this report sort of getting at. But the structural problems, I think, are killer. And I've done like 20-some countries of meeting with local tech and local civil society, and the thing I've come away with is donor-led projects are just really problematic. Yes, you need them for things like elections, but more and more I see my job is figuring out ways to identify and cultivate local leaders, let them fail, let them experiment, let them learn, give them support and scaffolding, and we should find ways to help them do what they want to do, whether or not we think it's the best idea, because the best you're going to do with a donor-led project is giving somebody a fish, and that doesn't develop civil society. Go visit Iraq. There's been billions spent, or hundreds of millions on civil society, and I cannot come up with a country that has a lower sort of maturity with civil society. So money isn't the problem. It's how do you, and I think this sort of lays out, sort of the blocks of an ecosystem that needs to be there for political viability. But to make the change, it's much more about finding people in the location that can do it. At USAID, we're really not peace builders. We sort of come to the conclusion that the people in Afghanistan are the peace builders, right? They're the ones that are going to change their country, not us. So how can we enable that? And I think that's, I'll stop there.
Yeah, that's great. So why don't we I'll do a couple of questions, and just all four of you, just feel free to jump in, and you can find over the mics. And then we'll do some Q&A with other folks here. But, so I have one question, or one takeaway I had from the study, which I'll now flip as a question. A lot of the critique, which is, I would subscribe to, which is basically if you just throw tech at it, it doesn't work. Absolutely right. The answer in the report is sort of, the usual stuff of you need political will, or context matters, or just one of these kind of throwaway lines. I don't mean that pejoratively, but it's kind of, I don't think we're there yet in terms of this report, or even kind of some full understanding within the community of what is that missing piece, what does it look like. So I'm curious, to put it this way, can you see political will, something like that, or is this a crutch we throw at problems we actually can't well describe? So if it isn't tech, if it is the enabling environment, or sort of, again, fill in the blank with the euphemism of choice, what is it that we're looking for, or even from some of these case studies or other stories and experiences you've had that you saw that did turn the corner? So when you set aside the tools and the tech and the techniques, what was the missing link at the political or the human level, the societal level, that sort of filled that gap, if that makes sense?
I mean, I think that a very simple statement like political will is actually an incredibly difficult thing to unpack. And to really understand political will, you need to dive deep into sort of a political economy of what the incentives are of the individuals that you're trying to get their behavior to change. So you're not trying to change their behavior, but you want them on their own to decide they want to change their behavior. And I always operate under the assumption that people are in a political world, which is maybe naive, are operating as fairly rational actors, right? So they are making choices that are the correct choices for what they're trying to accomplish. So it seems to me that you need to understand what their incentives are, and then figure out how you're going to put in place something to change those incentives. Is it possible, drawing back to the subject matter, that we could leverage technology to do that? I think it certainly is, but again, it has to be much, much deeper than that. And it gets at what the electoral system is it a party list system? If you're talking about parliament, if it's a parliament, is it a party list system? Is it single member districts? All these things. So I think, yes, political will is everything, but it's something that's really difficult to unpack.
Yeah, just to add on that a little bit, I think you're absolutely right. It's all about people acting in their own enlightened self-interest to be more responsive to citizens, and that's created through all the things that we know that it's created by accountability, transparency, and I think, Josh, you're absolutely right that people build a structure. Not only do they do the thing that's in their interest, but they also try to build a structure around them that continues that to work in their interest. And so I think one of the areas where people believe the technology is successful, the technology has been successful, where there are opportunities, is the destabilizing factor that it can create because it's moving so quickly, it's moving the way that people relate so quickly, it's moving the way that people get information, give information. There are opportunities to destabilize that in a way that creates an opportunity. Now, what happens in that moment of destabilization is also very important. This gets back to some of the things that Ken was saying when he set this all up. It's not enough just to destabilize that stasis, that status quo. There needs to, that is step one towards moving towards a better situation, and needn't always move positively.
Just a quick thought on that. I think we talk about interaction with government, and I think this is almost like a secondary level step of just thinking through citizen participation, right? So if the civil society isn't really good at cultivating citizen participation, to now expect the first step to be interacting with government, whether or not there's political space, I mean, that's a really hard step, right? Like, you've got to figure out how to do that independent of government first. Like, a good example, Moldova and Romania in 2011 had this great thing called Hi Moldova and Hi Romania, which was all about crowdsourced trash collection. Like, you had thousands of people showing up. For the first time in Moldova, it was like the first crowdsourced event where, there's a site you could sign up for, and people randomly sort of were, organized locally and did their own trash pickup in their own area, which was huge and had no government participation, right? That wasn't what was driving it. But doing those kind of steps first before then engaging in open government, I think, is an important thing. And so Maria Steffen, my colleague here, mentioned at the beginning, in the political space here, if you don't have a political space, the question should be, how do you get the citizens to start developing and creating the political space versus waiting for the government to provide it, right? And there's a whole set of strategies and tactics that, she's a civic mobilization expert and can go through a myriad of levels on that, but if we're not able to get the government to citizen interaction, I don't think the only avenue is to try to, figure out where you go on the government side. It's to figure out how the citizens themselves can start taking ownership of their own communities and their own space independent, of the government. Like a great example, Antigua, Guatemala. They're, this wonderful little city 40 minutes outside of Guatemala City, which is, very problematic and, dangerous. But Antigua is just this beautiful, wonderful thing. And they have no real functioning federal government in the way of trying to bring business to the city. So they're trying to think through, how can we lobby other countries to, get business coming here? For a local community to almost take on what we in the United States look at as the Commerce Department, right, is an interesting question. And I think that's sort of the vignette, I would say, for how you start building the political space. If the government is not a participant, perhaps you can do it independently, but just as important is, how do you identify the local leaders in government who may not have positions of power, and how can you, find ways to enable them to do great things and sort of move up in there.
And I guess I would take a slightly different twist on this. Ian, you said something earlier about how technology had been good at sort of letting more of these voices be heard, but it wasn't very good at changing institutions. We're good at dealing with institutions, but not changing institutions. I would submit that, look, this whole information revolution has unleashed all of these voices. It's democratized information. It's democratized the ability to speak, whether you're heard very loudly or not, depends on how much money and access you have. But there's all of this out here. The politics is about self-government. That's about aggregating voices. And there are systems in place to do that now. And I think we need to have our expectations in check about what technology can do. Technology is not going to change those institutions. People are going to change those institutions. They're going to be changed through the current structures and processes that are in place. And the question is, I just keep coming back to it over and over again, is how you empower the local people to understand how to use these tools to change the existing institution structures. And so that needs to be the laser focus.
So I have a follow-up in some ways to a number of the comments, including the last couple. So Jonathan Fox is here from American University. I see in the back, he has some good research that's coming out that sort of talks about this, I think, John, the sandwich effect of actually effective social accountability and bottom-up grassroots work, which is, it tends to work much better, we now know, with the emerging evidence when there's actually help or teeth on the government side for sanctions, for accountability, and for really driving home and cementing those reforms. So you can put up 1,000 crisis maps and complaint hotlines, but unless you have a partner or at least a grudgingly willing ally on the government side or the regulator side, this stuff doesn't tend to stick. So that's a thesis, but there's a lot of emerging evidence from a lot of work. And I think we've touched on that in several ways. So I'm curious from the four of you, have you seen examples of that pincer movement actually working, whether it's from the study or bits and pieces of it or just from other experience, and or if you haven't, sort of what would that look like in real life? Can you sort of sketch out that ideal, a partnership is probably too rosy of a frame, but at least a grudging acceptance on the part of those with their hands on the levers of power to respond to that feedback loop that citizens are trying to build.
I just want to comment on a parallel vote count in Nigeria. A few years ago, I was out there for the presidential election. I guess it was maybe I don't know when it was, 12 or 13. They'd had a lot of not great elections for many, many years. There was a head of an election commission that had been given money, had been given authority to actually run a real election. And so the parallel vote tabulation that NDI and our partners there set up was incredibly effective. They did the whole thing throughout the country, and in fact, the results that that count had were in days before the government got its count done. They'd agreed not to release those results. Ken, correct me if I'm wrong about some of this, until to release their results publicly until the government came out with results first. But they had shared some of these things with the government, so it was a very interesting. We have eyes on you. We are holding you accountable. We know what these results are, but we will be your partner in this. And after the results came out, and there was some rioting and protesting in certain parts of the country because of those, this third-party group was able to come in and stand up and say, that's right, that's exactly what we found, and then legitimized and reinforced what the government said. So that was an instance where there was a government partner who was, grudgingly or not, they were ready to go, and they had third-party actors who were there that could hold them accountable and also reinforce when they did the right thing.
Nathaniel, can I just add something to that?
Yeah, of course.
Because about this interaction and about organizational development, and to take what Robin said and expand it a little bit about domestic citizen election monitoring groups around the world. This was a relatively new concept that really began in the Philippines with NAMFREL, the National Citizens Movement for Free Election, which armies should operate as well as NAMFREL did. 500,000 volunteers present at all 100,000 polling sites in the country. Did a quick count, which basically exposed the fraud in the election that led to the downfall of Marcos and the election of Aquino. But as a result of that inspiration, the inspirational work of NAMFREL, there are now close to 200 domestic election monitoring organizations around the world that represent close to 4 million monitors that learn their organizing skills around elections, became very influential in countries. Some work closely with election authorities. Some shared the information ahead of time, which led, I think, to acceptance of the results by the election authorities, by the governments. Sometimes, as was the case in Azerbaijan recently, the government threw all of them in jail as a result of their work. But they're now a common feature that everyone sort of takes for granted. But they all still exist today. Since NAMFREL's existence in 1986. So we have got institutions. Some of them have morphed. They've become good governance advocacy organizations. 180 parliamentary monitoring organizations that now have declarations on parliamentary openness that parliaments are now adopting. Many of those came from these election monitoring groups. And yet, and now they're employing much of the technology that we're all talking about to try to improve their work and enhance what they do and how they do it and the speed in which they do it. And yet you have other technologies in this field, like crowdsourcing, where you have things that are quite shiny, that go on maps, data, and yet there's nobody to aggregate that information, nobody that can verify the information, so in the end the information is lost. And what you have with these groups is you build social capacity. These groups now utilize technology, And they're proving that they have influence domestically and a standing internationally. And they're all sustainable. All of these groups that were established over the last 25 years are still in existence today. Some of them have established regional associations. Now there's an international coalition of these groups to provide peer-to-peer support. So there is an example, I think, where you have, over the last 25 years, the growth of these types of organizations. Some of them are feared, some of them are seen as supportive of the process. But I think it's just one example where technology and organization has come together to enhance the work.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Ian. Yeah, quick.
Yeah, I was just going to jump off the bit and come back to this notion of sort of the collaboration between civil society and government being where this works well. And I mean, I think, so jumping up what Ken's talking about, these groups existing and having this really powerful information, that in itself can be a powerful tool, but in certainly there are some cases where the Election Commission is happy to know that that's the case. And I remember Ghana, for instance, in 2009, the Election Commission, in an extremely close race, was getting pressure from the authorities, or from the government in power at the time, to accept certain things, not accept certain things in a way that would have changed the outcome of the election. And they were very happy to be able to say, no, we can't do that because other people have the results as well. And so that was somewhere where having that sort of collaboration and in a very collegial way allowed an election to be better than it might have otherwise. And I certainly know this firsthand from being in government. There were plenty of cases where I would want people to run an article about how bad we are at this thing I'm working on so that I can go to my bosses and say, look, we're getting killed on this, we need to do something differently. And I think that you do see those cases. On the crowdsourcing point, I mean, the best example of crowdsourcing in elections that I'm aware of is Cuidemos el Voto in Mexico. And there, one of the things that made it successful is they had a partnership with the group within their equivalent of the FBI, that was the Electoral Crimes Division. And so they were using that data as it was coming in to actually go after problem, or to go after some set of, at least, of the problems that were there. And that created a greater value proposition for people to participate in the exercise as well, which it's not surprising then that was also one of the crowdsourcing exercises around elections which saw the greatest participation.
And then, interesting, some of the lead technologists from the companies behind it are now in government.
That's right. Also, yeah, that's also true.
This whole ecosystem thing, we don't have time.
John? I like that metaphor of a sandwich. I think it seems actually really, not because I'm hungry, but no, I actually think it's really appealing, and I'm thinking about it in the context you had asked for sort of successes, and it seems that the ones that come to my mind, there's a sort of a pattern which is maybe not surprising, but could help us maybe target where we want to try to build these, using technology to build this sort of the sandwich, which is the institutions that already have built into their structure some sort of oversight mechanism. Right, so again, speaking the obvious, but sort of I'm thinking, where have I seen successes? And it's the human rights commissions, the ombudsman offices, certainly parliaments and courts have a significant, so you already have the incentive, you have a lower barrier to political will. I'm thinking in terms of, this is sort of a pre-technology example, but I know they're actually very literally wired in now. But like the Human Rights Commission in the Philippines, where I guess it was probably about 10 years ago, there was an enormous spike in extrajudicial killings. And there wasn't a lot of obvious political will to deal with it, at least. And I was actually quite surprised how rapidly they were able to address it, because there was this connection between obviously the Philippines is a very well-developed civil society and human rights organizations, and the Human Rights Commission. And they were literally able to sort of name and shame people on national television in a way that other parts of the government wasn't willing to do. And lo and behold, generals were transferred and other things happened, and the number of extrajudicial killings went down extremely fast. And I would actually see a lot of avenues for using technology to sort of play similar roles with those sorts of institutions.
Great.
I'm
Okay,
good.
brilliant. Good. So we have several minutes left. Why don't we try and do at least a round or two of really quick questions? So I extol everyone. Try and be brief but good. Let's take 2 or 3, and then we'll kind of come to the panelists real quick. Oh, sorry. Over there.
Hi, my name is Kathleen Schmerman. I work in the Africa Division at IRI. Thank you to all the panelists and the organizers of this event. One thing that was touched on at the beginning, but I would love to hear more about, is this gender gap. So some of the experiences that we've had at IRI in using technology, it has been a challenge to get women to use it, and not always because they have lack of access to the actual tool. In Kenya, for instance, they had mobile phones almost just as much as men. So could you talk a little bit more about the gender gap and maybe some suggestions, ideas? Thanks.
Great. Sir. Hang on one second.
My name is Becha Mebini, originally from Cameroon. I'm a recent graduate at American University, Washington College of Law. Actually, when I read the citizen participation yesterday, what really struck me was the fact that most of the studies didn't focus on the educational level of people in the third world country. I grew up in Cameroon, and most of the people that I grew up with ended up not going to high school. And as a result, most of them had never been in contact with a computer. So if you let me say that's like 40% of the population is not educated. They can't even use a computer or a smartphone. How can they like really understand the technological aspect of citizen participation in democracy or in an election? So I hope you guys can really talk something about that. Thank you.
Great. So 2 easy questions. Gender gap, sort of generational undereducation. Feel free to jump in and take one or both.
I could speak a little. I'm not an expert on our programs, the M-Women program, but I would say that one of the advantages of it is the intentionality, in the sense that. Sorry about that. When you bring together the actors that are the mobile comms operators and the tech companies, and you embed them, and you're trying to use market incentives. So that's where we found the most success. Where there is enough disposable income where you could have 2 mobile phones per household is a huge barrier if you don't have that. Generally, we found very limited success in being able to really enhance women's access to mobile devices when there's only 1 per household. And so we recognize that's a huge issue. The other thing is to try to, so we've had we're in the midst of a competition actually to come up with new applications that are specifically geared towards interfaces that are more gender friendly, including ones specifically for women that are illiterate or enumerate, that still have mobile phones, to allow them to use to like make financial transactions and other things. So it's really in the early stages, and I'll be happy to talk to you afterwards to get a little more.
Just a couple of comments. The gender gap, I don't think, is because women don't own phones, right? I mean, the same problem exists where the report is saying, gosh, you've given them technology and they're not participating. I think if there's power dynamics that prevent women from taking an active role, providing them mobile phones may not get you there, right? And to your point, the one thing I would have liked to see more in this report is really the urban-rural divide you get. You know, just take Burma. If you're talking to somebody on Facebook in Burma, they're in a city, right? There's less than 10% internet access. There's 14 gigabyte for the country to interact online. There's 16 armed conflicts in 40 different language groups. If you're not hitting community radio and maybe IVR systems on phones, you're not reaching a whole lot of people, right? So technology, to me, community radio is a huge enabling technology. And can you get the network of folks that are going to get you there? And that's, to me, the innovation that really needs to come to get to Ian's point is almost never going to be from the internationals. It's going to be from the local technologists. And so building these tech for social good ecosystems in developing countries, I think, is absolutely critical to start addressing those, because the people in Cameroon are going to be able the ones that are going to answer your question the best. They're going to be able to know, here's how you reach these people, and here's what works around contacts, here's how the SMS gateway works. I mean, there's a whole series of contextual specific things that you really need to find the local innovators, and by and large, they're generally technologists.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. The best technology and development, technology and innovation going on is being done by people at the local level who are using what's available to them because they're very creative at taking whatever they have available and solving problems. So, I mean, I do think that if you want to encourage that, it requires a different, as we were saying earlier, not to keep harping on this, but it requires a different approach to development and trying to be in a position where you're providing resources to create a better ecosystem for innovation and for empowerment without necessarily knowing who are the people who are going to take advantage of those and how are they going to use them. And that's sort of the approach that we took when I was doing Internet Freedom Programs with the State Department. We were trying to create a more safe, secure internet for whoever was going to, whoever wanted to use it, where there was greater levels of security, ability to freedom of expression, assembly, association online. But one of the things that we very deliberately decided early on is that we needed to expand beyond the usual suspects, the 5,000 to 10,000 highly targeted activists, journalists, and bloggers online, and make sure that we were trying to build tools that build a safer ecosystem or a better ecosystem for everybody, whether they're using mobile, whether they're using the internet. And that actually made everybody safer, because if you started building tools just for the journalists, then it was easy to see who was a journalist because they were using those tools. And so you do need to take a different sort of approach. And absolutely, I mean, I think going back to, well, maybe it could have been discussed more in this document. I think 9 principles and some of the others that are out there do look a little bit more at building with, co-creating with your end users, with your beneficiaries, to use an overused that term, but co-creating with those people, with people in mind, and making them part of the process. But I would say, in 2007, I went out to Sierra Leone, being sent out by NDI on the notion that I was basically being sent out to convince the field team that we shouldn't be using SMS. That using SMS to collect data around the election was an awful idea because the infrastructure was so bad and nobody knew how to use it, and it was just going to be a huge technological lift. But when we got out there, we started talking to people about what was the quickest way to get information back. Yeah, no, there wasn't SMS anywhere in an entire district, but the quickest way would involve SMS at some point in the chain. It would involve a kid getting on a motorbike to a clinic, to find a shortwave radio, to radio to the center, the district capital, where they could there get a connection and send it in, or it would involve a motorboat from a lake to the place where you could get a signal. And so you can use these tools as part of the chain and as a way to reach intermediaries and design your programs around that assumption without assuming that you're necessarily going to directly reach the people that you want to impact.
So in the interest of not holding folks hostage, even though we haven't been able to do much Q&A, let me go ahead and bring us to a formal close. Why don't we do a round of applause for Robin Carnahan in the second half. But a huge thanks to the organizers. Congratulations to Koval, Jared, others who contributed to the study. I mean, I think you can tell this has already made a really important and valuable contribution. So congrats. These are always big lifts behind the scenes, I'm sure. So I can only imagine with dread the number of versions and sort of edits that go into finishing this sort of thing up. But again, a huge thanks. Thanks everybody for coming, for sticking around, and again to the panelists.